And yep, looks like we're live.
Okay.
So whenever you're ready.
Being that we arrived at the appointed time of 6 o'clock, I just have a brief opening remark here to share, and then we'll jump right in. So our focus this evening is to understand the associated workload and timeline of a cost-saving measure that has been mentioned at this committee several times. This is not to indicate the resolve of the board being behind this decision, but this course of action deserves an opportunity to be understood, and that would be a schedule change at the secondary level. The most important merits of that decision will be presented on and discussed in a separate forum, likely the curriculum committee, as this is a discussion that will have significant implications for teaching and learning beyond this committee's appropriate purview. Our objective today, as mentioned before, is for the board to understand generally the work that would need to be done by our administrators to do this, the time that it would take, and what point in that process would decisions about corrected staff levels be made. With that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Campbell. And now, is it Mr. Flam or Dr. Flam now?
Dr. Flam.
Dr. Flam.
Yeah.
So I will hand it over to Mr. Flam and Dr. Campbell. I did it wrong. I will hand it over to Mr. Campbell and Dr. Flam to kind of help us understand that. And then Dr. Winters or Dr. Phillips, if you guys want to add to that discussion, I'd appreciate it.
Can respond.
I would just start by saying, a lot of the decision making would be dependent upon what the board has in mind in terms of changes. So, if we're looking at significant scheduling changes, it does take some time to do that. How much time? It's hard to say. That depends on what issues we face as we're moving through a schedule. I can only speak from historically my experience moving from the schedule that I inherited previously to the schedule that we're running now, which is a very complex schedule with a lot of moving pieces. It is a unique schedule that offers middle level students a lot of opportunity. That said, there was a lot of work to be done to get the schedule up and running. Why? Because it involved some physical plant changes, it involved some curricular changes, it involved some professional development in terms of understanding the schedule, and also in terms of different delivery methods for some of our teachers. So, there were a number of issues that went into the schedule change that complicated matters. I don't know what would be involved in a schedule change at this point to move in a different direction. So it's a little bit difficult to say what the timeline would look like without knowing kind of what we're operating with and toward.
And I'll comment a little bit about just timeline for a high school schedule. We start that process usually in earnest in November as we're putting together the program of studies. And by January, we are getting that approved so students start course selections. So I don't know, this is just off the top of my head, the program of studies may or may not be affected by that, but certainly course selections, we would have to have that dialed in before, or any changes would have to be dialed in long before that. And then structural changes would require looking at how that outcome would affect program of studies. I mean, in the end, we still are coming back to that question. The end of your question, Hunter, I think is really the critical part, which is the staff reduction. And that comes down to how many students are in front of any teacher at a given time. So there you're looking at certification issues and things like that. Those are all sort of dominoes in that row.
So I think one of the things that Eric, and I think, Tom, you were also alluding to this, related to some of the changes that you have to make that respect a new schedule related to certification issues, professional development, and even changes to the physical plant, which that's a new one to me. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Eric. Could those, most of them, be done after a schedule was formed? Or do those types of considerations need to really be fleshed out before a final decision is made?
That's a good question. I think some can be done as the process is unfolding. But, to be honest with you, and I'll give you a couple of examples, we decided to move forward with a one-to-one initiative because in doing so, it saved us some classroom space, and it allowed us to build STEM classrooms into some of those areas, which in turn created some physical plant issues. So when I talk about these things, consider the fact that at one point we had 2 computer labs, but when we brought our STEM program in, Project Lead the Way, we needed to reconfigure some of those areas. So it required us to take on some physical plant adjustments, some of which were fairly easy, some of which were more complex. So I raise those issues because they can complicate the issue, but some of what we're talking about can be done as we're moving through the process. Some has to be done up front. That decision about moving to a one-to-one initiative helped us to move forward with adjusting how we were going to deliver the computer applications program and who was going to do that and where that was going to be done. So that had to be done up front. The physical plant issues were happening concurrently with our building the schedule after that schedule was decided. So I think in answer to your question, Hunter, some can be done up front, some can be done during, and some will need to wait until we have answers to most of our questions.
Hunter, I think I would also kind of add to this conversation and say that I really think kind of the first step in the process starts over the summer when Dr. Flam, Mr. Campbell, myself, folks from the new teaching, from the teaching and learning department, Melissa, Andy, other folks sit down around a table together and talk about okay, we know that there are certain items that under Chapter 4 that we have to make sure that we offer because PDE requires that we offer it. Then there are other items that we're currently offering that are nice value adds. How do we, as a 712 continuum, where do we value some of those extras, and then make some decisions around, curricularly what we want to focus on in terms of the electives, in terms of which ones we want to try to still find a way to maintain and which ones there may be flexibility in doing some things differently. And then I think once those decisions are made, I think that then begins to drive how much modification needs to be done to an existing schedule in a building, because we may have to make significant modifications, we may have to make smaller modifications. It just depends. For example, this doesn't, and I'm not going on record as saying this is going to happen, but there are a lot of exploratory electives that are currently part of the junior high schedule. They're great opportunities for kids. Kids really enjoy them. They are not electives that are required under Chapter 4. So, if that's an area that we take a hard look at, and, as we're discussing, Dr. Flam says, I really think, in looking at, kind of our comprehensive education at the junior high, if we were going to make some adjustments, these would be some of those areas that, I'd kind of want to say, nope, we really, really want to keep these. These are some areas where I'd be willing to kind of concede and say we could make some adjustments here. Then I think once we have that more concrete information, then we can make a better decision in terms of what kind of change needs to occur to the junior high schedule. The same, logic and processing would be, in place at the senior high as well.
Okay. So I think, what I've taken so far is that direction really needs to come from the board as to what you guys would want to, or that we would want to see. So I guess my next question would be, what would that direction look like? Like, just as an example, if we said we want to reduce electives overall, but we want to have multi-year, how do I want to say this? Rotating electives, so that there are new electives coming in each year, so that we are still offering some of the electives that the students really enjoy now. We're just decreasing the offering numbers year to year. Is that, how much more to a proposal like that would you guys need for clear direction? And of course, you're going to be involved in this process no matter what would happen. So I'm not suggesting that it's just going to be a sentence decided by us, but I guess I'm trying to understand what that direction looks like.
Hunter, from my perspective, and I certainly want Eric and Tom to chime in as well, I would almost, prefer a dollar figure, as opposed to this is something, specific that we want you to do in terms of put electives on a rotation or whatever. We have such great knowledge and resources in terms of the human capital in the district that, I would much rather, if there's some guidance around, okay, we want to see, if we can realize some economic relief, based upon how we do scheduling, if we could realize economic relief, in the amount of, kind of guidance that way, then that enables us at the teaching and learning level to, kind of put our hats on and figure out, the best way to make that happen, without, ultimately trying to minimize the impact on kids, because that may necessitate having to put electives at one place on a rotation, and it might necessitate eliminating electives elsewhere. It's kind of hard to say that. So I would almost like the flexibility on the administrative end in terms of how we go about doing it. Again, I'm just one voice, but I'd love to know what Eric and Tom think. But that's my thought.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One, I think is really important that Tom touched on earlier, and that's the certification issue. Because if you're going to offer electives some years and not others, you're going to have to balance out those certifications and ensure
Good
that
point.
you have highly qualified teachers available to offer those things when you want them. The other piece, and I don't know if this is more an issue at the junior high than the senior high with the limited number of electives we have. Electives really are limited, and I would just say that whatever is being offered is absorbing students. Students must go somewhere. And if you take electives away, then you have to have a plan for where students are going to go in place of those things. And so it's not just a matter of taking things away. If you take something away, then you have to have a plan for what you're going to offer in place of that. Where are kids going to go in place of that? So, and there are a variety of ways to think through that. For example, in our previous schedule, there were opportunities to have for students to have a study hall. So if students didn't elect for certain things or didn't take a course and had a hole in their schedule, were limited credits, they went to a study hall. Well, in order for us to build in opportunities for students, one of the things that we did was we took study halls away. And, we went to a different mindset with study halls in terms of offering them, but they're more of a tutorial, more specific to helping students who need it. So, I guess, cautioning along the way that it's not just as easy as removing things. You have to have a plan for what you're going to offer implicit that. And that could come in the way of, lengthening some courses or adjusting times or something like that. But, there's a jigsaw effect to that as well. The longer a course, the longer the duration in minutes, of course, the fewer those sections teachers can teach, obviously. So, all of this is jigsawed together. But I agree that a dollar figure would be helpful. I think that it would help us to wrap our heads around kind of where the board wants to go.
I would echo what Eric's saying. I think the key is class size. I mean, we're not changing the number of students in the building, and they have to be somewhere. So how those students get divided around the building, that's what we try to do to strike balance. But in the end, it's still there's one equation in the end, and that is number of kids divided by the number of teachers, because they have to be in front of a teacher at every minute.
I used to work for a guy who worked in the Nixon White House, and he was used to presenting the president with options. They had to have at least 3 options. So since what I'm hearing is that you're looking for some sort of guidance, would it be possible to prepare 3 options with $1 million, $750,000, and $500,000 as a target?
I mean, if that's, I suppose we could, I've not thought about that, other than our ongoing efforts to look for ways that we've not filled positions that have gone in retirements recently. But I mean, you're talking about, I mean, if you're saying, you're talking about staff then.
Well, however you come up with a dollar figure.
Well, if we're talking about if we're talking about scheduling teachers, I mean, I'm assuming that's what you're referring to. I mean, we're not talking about supplies or things like that.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think the dollars are there, but I'm just trying to get the ball rolling.
And just as a clarification, Mr. Fiddler, are you, so those figures, are you saying that like that's secondary 7 to 12 collectively? Or are you thinking like one figure for junior high and one figure for senior high?
I just thought of it this minute.
Okay, that's
Well,
fine.
I
That's
think
fine.
what I interpreted John's question was an example of, could we provide options around dollar figures?
Yeah,
because,
you
I
could.
think the board is well aware of the secondary education schedule probably has over, I would think, $15 million in just regular instruction alone. So, and I'm just shooting from the hip there. So I think what I took John's question was really just an example around that number, not that specific number. Is that fair, John?
Oh, yeah, I don't think the numbers really matter at this point. What I was looking for, would it be possible to develop and present 3 options, whether it's half to 750,000 or $500,000, $1 million, and 1.5. I mean, the numbers themselves don't matter. What I heard somebody say, I don't know if it was you, Eric, or you, Tom, that you need a dollar figure to shoot for. So I was just, again, trying to push the stone off the side of the mountain and get it rolling.
Yeah, options are definitely something that, we could do, for sure. I don't see that. I think that's, once we identify what those, figures might be, we could certainly put something together that, addresses, each of those potential scenarios.
Yeah, because I think what the current process is teaching us is that this is not a once and done this year to deal with the current situation. We're going to have to really pay closer attention to the budget in the future and make sure that every dollar we spend is a dollar well spent.
And I think in presenting those different options, if we were to go down that route, it would be important to understand, do they fit together? Because I think what I heard a few times, and I think Eric, you used the word jigsaw. One jigsaw schedule may not integrate well if you just said, let's pull schedule A and just insert schedule B. They may not work well to each other. So I think it'd be important to see, if almost like, as an example, how we had talked about privatizing busing. If we had gone down the route of privatization, it would be very difficult to get back into busing because we would have to look at starting a new fleet from scratch. In the same way, I think it would be onerous to expect that one schedule change happened this year, and then because we have further complications with our financial outlook, we need to do another schedule the next year.
Yeah, because predictability for kids is important, and so, if we're going to, make a change to a schedule, then, making that change, kind of as Eric talked about, making sure that if additional professional development is needed, that, that's provided, that we have enough lead time to, have conversations with our teachers, to communicate it, effectively, and thoroughly with the community, because any of our parents who have had children that have come through the junior high or the senior high, under the current existing schedules, if we make changes to schedules, they're going to have children coming in, under a new schedule. They're going to have questions, but all of that is part of it. But like I said, I think it starts with that conversation and that planning at the district level with Tom and Eric and others to figure out how we might get to those goal figures and provide some options that can continue the conversation.
Before I pivot a little bit with my next question, do any of the other board members have any questions here? Because I want to follow up with Ann about a question that rises from this, but I don't want to pivot too quickly.
Yeah, Hunter, I have a question. and I'm not sure if a question or an observation. I know we've had conversations previously about the board policy related to class size. And I'm thinking, mainly about at the secondary level, whether or not we run a program if we have fewer than a certain threshold or number of students. And I guess my question is, is that one of the first things that we should be looking at if we're looking to try to maybe scale back or save costs? And is that something that is even achievable or something we should be looking at now, even for implementation this school year, or would this have to be part of the plan for 21, 22?
I think if I'm understanding you correctly, I think it's going to hit if everything lines up properly. But what we see at the high school is that those examples of courses that fall below that 15 that's been used, they pop up in a variety of places. Many of them are capstone or AP courses that are in different certifications. So I don't think it's going to be that easy. Unless you were looking at part-time staff, and I brought that up before as a concern because that doesn't, I don't think that's effective for maintaining teachers in a district.
We were actually going to discuss the topic of classroom floor. It was actually going to be at I think we talked about a future curriculum committee meeting to address it. It was right around the February, March timeframe, and then the pandemic happened and we kind of shifted our focus a little bit. I definitely think that it's an important thing to discuss. And we do have, there is a class size policy. A floor currently is not in it. The districts that have a classroom floor they have language in that class size policy to that end. Mifflin has a policy like that, as does Daniel Boone. So, I think we could definitely, take a look at that policy over the summer and even into the fall, and add a floor component that would be in place in time for the course selection process when that begins in November, as Mr. Campbell indicated, so that as part of course selection, school counselors know, high school administration knows, department heads know that, this is going to be our guideline. And most of those class floor policies have language in it that if there's a capstone course or an AP course, that there needs to be an exception, that the superintendent can make a recommendation to the board that exception be made.
And I guess my other part of my question is that have we given any thought to the idea that there may be some courses that are chronically under enrolled, and that students might be able to access the same content but not access it through our district instruction? In other words, through online options, online instructional options, through a contract with an online provider. And has that been discussed as a possible option?
That's not been something that I've considered at the high school. But I would say that to your question about consistently undersubscribed courses, those tend to disappear. Or we look at, how does that get combined with other courses? Like, and I don't think this is exactly what you're talking about, but we do have, if you look on the surface, there are a number of courses at the high school that by themselves only have a few kids in them, but the, sorry, I can't control that one. Those courses are layered, and it happens in a few areas. Art's a classic one. We have a number of students that are in studio art courses at one level, in a studio with other students that are in studio art course at the same time. So when you walk in the classroom has over 15 students. But if you look on the roster, it may appear that there's a class of 4 and then a class of 12, and sometimes there's even a third class in there too. So I think the key is looking at how many kids are in a classroom at a time, not necessarily how many students are in a section at a time, because there's quite a few layered courses for that purpose.
I think, one of the things that you find with online content is that a lot of these courses that have lower numbers in the high school, if it were, English 10 or civics or algebra 2 or those core subjects, it would be very easy to meet those course needs with an online course through Edgenuity or any number of different third-party vendors that are out there. But if Guitar Lab is, low, there's not an online alternative for that. There's some online business courses, but they may not necessarily be the same online business courses that we offer at Exeter. So I think the opportunity that, you're referencing, Dr. Hemberger, is I think, as we, continue to kind of think future down the road with our virtual programs, I'm going to touch on this a little bit at the board meeting tonight as well, is that, is there a way to, in some of those elective areas, have teachers, build courses on Schoology, like, perhaps we can build accounting 2 on Schoology that Mrs. Blackburn, could teach. And if there are only, if there are 15 kids in the brick and mortar accounting 1 and 8 kids that want accounting 2, combine them together, put the 8 kids in the online accounting 2 Schoology course, and you can do some stacking, just like Mr. Campbell talked about with art. So I do think there can be opportunities to that end moving forward. But there might be a couple of elective courses that match with what Edgenuity has to offer in the elective area, but not as many as, one might think originally.
Thank you.
And I want to turn to you quick and ask based on Patrick's suggestion, and I think Eric, you had said that this would be helpful direction, and Tom, if you disagree, chime in here. But how difficult would it be to arrive at the number that the junior high school schedule and the senior high school schedule incurs? So the base point where we would start to say, compared to what we do now, this is what we would like to see it at.
You're looking for what their current budget is for staff?
Yeah.
That can be done relatively easily.
Okay. So we would be able to arrive quickly at, let's say the direction was $25 million for the senior high school. That's what we want to do. And we can say that right now we spend $21 million for the senior high school. And that would be an all-encompassing figure that we would be able to work from.
I guess in listening to everyone, it almost seems to me that putting a dollar target out there is putting the cart before the horse. And don't we really have to decide as a district what program we want to offer at the junior and senior high? Sure, we can have numbers to align, but I think there has to be a plan or a direction. I mean, having numbers to look at and also looking at ratios of students to staff. But I think the board and the administration need to agree on what we really want to offer. What do we want it to look like?
So based on that, and maybe all of you guys can respond to this, would it be a better strategy if we want to go down this path to first of all have that number, and for us to ask softly, what would a really rough sketch look like if we were to say to reduce the schedules at the junior high and the senior high to reflect $1 million in savings? And then you guys would be able to provide a rough sketch that could eventually, I would guess, be turned into a resolution that the board would take action on. Because some of this is challenging because you have to make course scheduling on this within the budget year that we're currently working on now. So to make this decision, if we wanted to look at having the impact seen in the budget next year, would need to be done in the middle of a budget year. And we'd probably have to take some type of formal action to endorse that. Is that a workable model, or is there more that I'm not alluding to with what Ann had mentioned?
Just to be clear, when you say reduce schedules, you're talking reduce staff, reduce FTEs.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Which is not necessarily a function of the structure of the schedule. It can be a byproduct, but you're in the end you're looking at from a budgetary lens.
I would, from the standpoint of our current schedule, I would say that a reduction in staff would be very, very difficult to manage under the context of our current schedule. So, you would have to create a situation that's more fluid than what we have currently, and that would allow for, some multiple grade teaching possibly. I don't even know what that would look like just off the top of my head, but I think, the current schedule makes it very, very difficult to maneuver staff within that schedule.
In the high school, it varies. I mean, if it's a direction that we're going, that we're cutting programs, then that is one path. if it's a reduction in certain areas. I mean, we've been very fortunate in that in the last 2 years, we've had retirements in areas that certifications were broad, and that allowed us to move some people around. And we were also very fortunate that, again, from two sides, from the number side, from when the students have signed up for courses, and it also had the effect that we were able to not replace staff in PE and English. But those are two areas where we have in PE, it's not a broad certification, but they teach a broad spectrum of kids across the building. They have large numbers, and English is a broad certification. I don't think we could have had that same simplicity if we had a chemistry teacher retire, because that is a much narrower certification, unless we were able to have people that have enough certifications across other areas. We do have that, and that's what's given us some of that flexibility for this year in order to fill those English holes.
I mean, I think, kind of, big picture, Hunter, to kind of circle back a minute. I think, what we're hearing a lot from both Mr. Campbell and Dr. Flam is that, this is a pretty complex process. There are a lot of moving pieces, and there are a lot of things to consider. And I think it's really, difficult to, kind of beyond saying we need to start the conversation over the summer, because whatever decisions are ultimately made by administration are going to have an impact on scheduling next year. It's tough to say kind of exactly what we need right now, because there are other conversations that need to happen. This topic, as some others we've discussed, does overlap with curriculum committee, as you mentioned at the outset. And, so, I think it needs to have some dialogue there. Maybe, maybe our initial next step, if it's something that this committee and the larger board is comfortable with, is to, be able to sit down over the summer, as a teaching and learning team at the district level, talk about, secondary in particular, kind of prioritize, what do we value, what is important to us in terms of ensuring that our kids get a quality education, recognizing education's a people business and the value of human capital and all of those things, and then be able to kind of begin to, flesh out, what that might look like. Then I think we'll have more information that we can share, at a committee level and ultimately, with the board in terms of the direction we're heading. Right now it's still very big picture, because, there are a lot of more granular conversations that we need to have. And with everything that is part of finishing up the school year in a, pandemic time, a lot of these conversations won't really develop in earnest until we get into the summer.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, Patrick, and I appreciate both Mr. Campbell and Dr. Flam participating with us. And there's just one more thing I want to add on this subject, and then if anybody else wants to add anything, we can go ahead and do that. And then there's just one other thing on the agenda, and then we're good to go for this evening. But I think really the big picture context that we're looking at is that the current financial framework that we're operating under is not sustainable in the long term. In two respects, I think it's primarily an expenditure respect, but I think that operates within an environment in the state where our revenues are significantly lower than what we think they need to be in order to provide the best product for students. With that being said, I think it's clear to me, at least, that there's a significant amount of data that we've been able to see from comparing to peer districts to show that our FTE equivalents are much higher at the secondary level than some of our other peer districts. The one that strikes in my mind is always Governor Mifflin. That's the one that I mentioned. But I think we looked at several other districts that we examined earlier this year, I believe in March in our February meetings with that data. And we're looking, I think, seriously at how we would work to pare that down. And I think that this was the most effective way while maintaining and respecting the product that we need to deliver to students. But if there is another way to go about doing that, I think that, as this conversation proceeds, that would be an excellent thing to hear from you guys. So with that, I'm good. I appreciate you guys sharing your thoughts with us, and I hope you continue to engage. And if there are things that you can think about, to share them with us as well, because being on the school board proves to you how not smart you really are. And this has been a tremendously trying process this year alone, and I'm sure it will continue to be. And I'm sure that that's probably true for you guys as well. So with that, if there's anybody else who wants to say anything on this in closing, we can, and then we'll shift over to the last agenda item.
No, Hunter, I'd just like to say, I appreciate you kind of putting it or framing it in that way, because, one of the things that, I'm thinking in my mind is, it's important for us to kind of help define what we view the problem as. And and I think, what you said or alluded to, in your comments was that it appears as if when we examine Exeter in relation to other, comparable districts, we have a higher FTE in certain areas, and why. So I think defining areas, maybe specific areas as to why we're higher, and an explanation for that. What are we investing in that other districts aren't investing in? And do we value those? If we value those, then they need to be maintained, and then we make decisions in terms of how we support those. But and I'm sure we're not providing anything right now that we don't currently value. Maybe I should say we need to prioritize those, because there are certain things that are obviously mandated and are critical and absolutely necessary. And then there are things that are great to have, and really enhance student interest and engagement in school, but aren't necessarily those things that we would consider to be absolutely critical or required. And maybe that's the difference between an Exeter and a Governor Mifflin when you're making those kind of comparisons. So I'd like to better understand why that difference exists, and where it exists, in what areas, and then examine those specific areas and say, are these things we intend to keep, or are these things that we can do without?
What is an FTE?
Full-time equivalent. Sorry, John.
And what, I don't, it's still not clear. What is a full-time equivalent of what?
Of staff.
I think it's somebody who works 35 hours or more. Is that right?
Yeah, it'd be like one person would be one FTE.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about a full-time employee.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I'm sorry. That was that's not clearly defining our acronyms.
Yeah, and I don't think I said it right either. I think I said FTE equivalent, which is not right, but yeah. Okay, so with that, there's one last thing on the agenda that I want to discuss quickly, which is discussing whether the committee would be comfortable with sending a resolution to the board. I would develop this resolution like I did with the fire drills one. And it would, of course, be reviewed by our solicitor if need be, and probably wouldn't be on the agenda anytime this month, obviously. To ask that the legislature not raise our PSERS contribution rate in the next budget year. So that decision will be made not by the legislature, actually. I think that decision is made by the PSERS governing board in December. And is it November or December of this year for the next budget year?
In December, they will certify the rate for 21-22.
Okay. So we would be asking that governing board, and we'd probably also send it to our legislators and to the governor's office, that they would not raise our contribution rate. That would I don't want to try and predict the future without a tremendous amount of evidence. But if that rate were to be increased, that would be a significant expense that would further exacerbate, I think, the challenges that we're already facing. And I think that this is just one more way that we can try and advocate on behalf of the district. And, I want to see if there's any concerns with going ahead and doing that.
Would it carry more weight if we teamed up with other districts or went through the BCIU?
I think so.
Yeah, Hunter, can I just jump in for a second? Today I was on a call with Peasers and not Peasers, PSBA. And, they were talking about resolutions, board resolutions, and they often are the sort of the catalyst or the driving force behind the development of resolutions. And I would first check with them to see if they maybe have already established or created a resolution for districts to consider. The other resolution, though, that I'm aware of that we should be, I think, passing as a board as soon as possible is a request to the state legislature to have comparable funding and no reduction in state funding from this year to next year, like flat funding at the very least, at a minimum, with no reduction from previous year. And I don't think we're expecting an increase, in our basic ed funding, but I think, we should be expecting at least flat funding, and that's not a guarantee at this point right now. So Peasers is encouraging, PSBA is encouraging all districts to embrace that resolution and pass it. So I would like to recommend that this group also suggest to the rest of the board that we move forward with that as well.
Well, I'll want to read the text of that. I expect that I would definitely be in support of that, but I just want to make sure I want to read the text of that.
Sure.
But I have no problem with that being a recommendation from this committee to be voted on in June, especially if PSBA already has a draft copy created. So I think that would be great.
Districts are already passing it now, so June would be good timing. Yeah.
So what I am gathering, and correct me if I'm wrong here, John or Dave, is that before drafting our own resolution to that effect to investigate whether PSBA or the BCIU already has drafted one, and then from there maybe we can pick that conversation up for whether it needs to be included on an agenda between us in the future.
Yeah, I have a BCIU board meeting Thursday night, and I can ask if other districts have given it any consideration at this time.
Yeah, and maybe the suggestion could even be made for the BCIU to send one out. And like I said, I'm happy to develop it. I have no problem doing that. I don't want to create more work for other people, even though I often do. But whatever they want to do, I'm kosher with. Okay, well, I think we have a better idea about how this moves forward. I think my guess is that for this first conversation, I think what's really going to happen at this point is I'll probably send an email to Anne as a non-priority item, and I mean that in terms of probably getting to it in a couple of weeks or so, for trying to have maybe a very broad breakdown of what those costs would be currently at the high school, and the junior high school, so that those could be integrated into a conversation, maybe at the curriculum committee for next steps. And then we can see, I guess there may have to be discussion at either, it'd probably be most appropriate for July. Well, we'll get that information. We'll figure out how this moves forward, but I think that this is going to be an ongoing conversation that starts to shift towards the forefront. But again, if there's any suggestions that people have to trying to understand this or look at this issue differently, feel free to reach out. All right, with that, if there are no other comments, I think we are good to call it an evening to join an even longer evening. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.